Good evening. Let us look more carefully at what is happening here tonight, because what you are being told and what is actually unfolding are two very different things. The headlines are calling this a diplomatic standoff. The commentators are calling it a face-off between two exhausted powers, circling each other across the Persian Gulf. Some are already writing the obituary of American influence in the Middle East. And Iran's leadership, from the Supreme Leader's office in Tehran to the commanders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, appears to believe that it has won, that the era of American strategic dominance over that region is finished, that Washington is too divided, too distracted, too politically wounded to respond with anything except carefully worded statements and symbolic gestures. They declared that victory loudly. They declared it prematurely. And Washington's response, when it came, was not what anyone in Tehran expected. Tonight, we are going to pull the lens back completely and explain not just what happened in the last 72 hours, but why Iran's confidence is one of the most strategically dangerous miscalculations made by any regional power in the last 3 decades, and why the consequences of that miscalculation are now cascading across 4 separate theaters simultaneously in ways that most analysts have not yet begun to connect. If you have been watching this channel, you already know that geopolitical turning points rarely announce themselves cleanly. They arrive disguised as ordinary news cycles. This is one of those moments. Stay with us through the full analysis, because the picture that emerges by the end of tonight's script is not the picture you are seeing anywhere else. Let us begin by rejecting the frame that most of the media has placed around this story. The dominant narrative runs roughly like this. Iran tested the limits of American patience. The United States responded with some combination of sanctions and military repositioning, and now we are in another chapter of the long, grinding standoff that has defined U.S.-Iran relations since 1979. That narrative is not wrong in its details. It is wrong in its depth. It mistakes the surface choreography for the underlying architecture. And if you only read the surface, you will misunderstand completely what Washington has actually set in motion. Here is the deeper question that nobody in mainstream commentary is asking tonight. Why did Iran choose this particular window, the spring of 2025, to project maximum confidence and declare strategic victory? The answer to that question opens a door into the real story. Because when you understand why Tehran believed the moment had arrived, you begin to understand exactly why Washington's response hit so much harder than Iran's leadership anticipated. The timing was not accidental on either side, and the response was not improvised. What you are watching tonight is the activation of a strategy that has been assembled quietly over the previous 18 months, and Iran walked directly into it. Before we go deeper, if this kind of analysis, the kind that pulls apart the architecture behind the headlines, is why you come to this channel, then take a moment now and subscribe. We do not do breaking news for its own sake. We do the structural work underneath the breaking news, and that work takes time. Subscribe so that you do not miss what is coming next, because the story we are building tonight does not end here. Now let us lay down the structural foundations properly, because you cannot understand Washington's response without first understanding the 5 separate pressure systems that Iran believed had neutralized American leverage. The first layer is the fiscal constraint argument. Iran's strategic community, and it does have serious strategic thinkers, let us not underestimate them, had watched the United States accumulate $36 trillion in national debt by the beginning of 2025. They had watched the political warfare in Washington over budget ceilings, defense appropriations, and foreign aid packages. They concluded, not without reason, that the American political system had become too internally paralyzed to sustain another major foreign commitment. This was a real observation. It was simply an incomplete one. The second layer is the Ukraine exhaustion thesis. Tehran had been watching the protracted nature of the war in Ukraine drain not just American military stockpiles, particularly artillery shells, Patriot interceptor missiles, and precision munitions, but also American political will. The congressional fights over Ukraine aid packages, the growing isolationist wing of the Republican Party, the public polling that showed declining American appetite for overseas commitments, all of this fed a conviction inside Iran's leadership that Washington was strategically overextended and psychologically retreating. Again, real data, incomplete conclusion. The third layer is what Iranian strategists privately refer to as the multipolar buffer. The deepening relationship between Iran, Russia, and China, formalized through the 25-year cooperation agreement signed with Beijing in March of 2021 and strengthened through subsequent military technical exchanges with Moscow, gave Tehran a belief that any American escalation would now carry prohibitive diplomatic costs. China has repeatedly blocked or diluted UN Security Council resolutions targeting Iran. Russia has provided diplomatic cover and, in some domains, technological assistance. Iran believed it had constructed a protective architecture that made decisive American action politically impossible at the global level. The fourth layer is the proxy resilience argument. Since October 7th of 2023, the broader axis of resistance, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, various militia formations in Iraq and Syria, had demonstrated a capacity for sustained operational pressure against both American assets and Israeli positions that previous American policymakers had consistently underestimated. The Houthis alone disrupted roughly $21 billion in Red Sea shipping between December 2023 and the end of 2024, according to Lloyd's of London underwriting data. Iran had watched its proxies absorb American and Israeli strikes and continue operating. It concluded that the proxy network had become durable enough to impose costs that Washington would choose to avoid. The fifth layer, and perhaps the most seductive, is the nuclear threshold calculus. Iran has spent 2 decades advancing its uranium enrichment program in careful, calibrated increments. By early 2025, its stockpile of uranium enriched to 60%, just below the 90% threshold for weapons-grade material, was sufficient, according to the International Atomic Energy Agency, to produce multiple nuclear devices within weeks if the decision were made to break out. Iranian leadership appears to have concluded that this threshold proximity itself functioned as a deterrent, that Washington would not risk triggering a nuclear decision by applying decisive military or economic pressure. This was the most dangerous layer of the miscalculation, and it is the one that Washington's response was specifically designed to address. Now pull back and look at these 5 layers together. Each one contains genuine intelligence. Each one identifies a real constraint on American power. The error was not in the individual observations. The error was in the synthesis, in the conclusion that 5 partial constraints add up to one complete strategic paralysis. History is very unforgiving of that particular category of mistake. Let us go one level deeper, because the structural explanation alone is not sufficient. We need the historical pattern, and this pattern has appeared before in unmistakable form. The relevant precedent is not, as many commentators reflexively suggest, the Islamic Revolution of 1979, or even the nuclear standoffs of the early 2000s. The most precise historical parallel is the Egyptian strategic miscalculation of May and early June of 1967. President Gamal Abdel Nasser had spent years building a regional coalition, expelling UN peacekeeping forces from the Sinai, blockading the Strait of Hormuz, and delivering speeches that declared Arab strategic dominance. His intelligence services had given him a picture of Israeli military capacity that was fundamentally wrong. He had watched American domestic politics during the Johnson administration and concluded that Washington was too consumed by Vietnam, too politically constrained to either intervene directly or provide Israel with decisive support in the critical window. He declared victory over an adversary he had not yet engaged. On June 5, 1967, Israel launched Operation Focus. In 6 days, the strategic architecture that Nasser had spent a decade constructing was dismantled completely. The parallel is not perfect. Historical parallels never are, but the structural logic is almost identical. A regional power observing real constraints on its primary adversary, synthesizing those observations into a conclusion of adversary paralysis, announcing strategic dominance before the adversary has responded, and then discovering that the adversary's response was neither paralyzed nor improvised, but had been assembled quietly, deliberately, and with much greater precision than the regional power's intelligence had detected. The second historical parallel worth examining runs through the Falklands crisis of 1982. The Argentine military junta had conducted a sophisticated analysis of British domestic politics, the state of the Royal Navy, following budget cuts under the Thatcher government's early fiscal reforms, the distance and logistical difficulty of projecting force 8,000 miles into the South Atlantic, and the apparent American reluctance to side decisively against a fellow Western Hemisphere nation. General Leopoldo Galtieri concluded that Britain would negotiate rather than fight. He was catastrophically wrong. The Iron Lady did not negotiate. She sent the fleet, she recovered the islands, and the Argentine junta collapsed within months. The third historical parallel is more recent and closer to Iran's own experience. In the summer of 2006, Hezbollah's leadership, with Iranian backing and a genuine conviction that Israel's military had become risk-averse and politically constrained, launched a cross-border operation that killed 3 Israeli soldiers and captured 2. Hassan Nasrallah later acknowledged publicly that if he had known Israel's response would be 33 days of sustained military campaign, he would not have ordered the operation. He had read the intelligence of constraint accurately. He had read the willingness to absorb costs completely wrong. These 3 precedents share a single structural lesson that is so consistent across history, it should be treated as a law of strategic behavior. Regional powers that mistake adversary constraint for adversary paralysis and then publicly declare victory on the basis of that mistake reliably produce adversary responses that are more sustained, more precise, and more strategically consequential than any response that quiet deterrence would have generated. The declaration of premature victory is itself a trigger. It removes the adversary's option to exercise restraint while saving face. It makes the adversary's domestic politics and its alliance management require a decisive response. Iran's leadership, which contains serious students of both Islamic history and regional geopolitics, appears to have temporarily lost sight of this lesson. Now let us examine what Washington's response actually consists of, because the media coverage has focused on the most visible elements while missing the 3-dimensional architecture underneath. The first and most visible component is the accelerated deployment of the Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group and the USS Harry S. Truman Strike Group into the Eastern Mediterranean and the Northern Arabian Sea, respectively. 2 carrier groups in adjacent theaters simultaneously is not a routine rotation. The last time the United States maintained dual carrier strike group presence in those theaters was during the height of the ISIS campaign in 2015 and 2016. The signal is deliberate. The logistics are not improvised. Pre-positioning of this scale requires weeks of preparation, which means the decision was made well before Iran's public declarations of victory, which is itself a revealing detail. The second component is the executive activation of secondary sanctions architecture targeting Iranian petrochemical export chains through intermediary jurisdictions. Specifically, the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control moved against 17 entities in the United Arab Emirates, 4 in Turkey, and 6 in the People's Republic of China that had been identified as active conduits for Iranian oil revenues in violation of existing sanctions regimes. The financial figures here are significant. The conduit entities being targeted collectively processed an estimated $4 to $6 billion annually in Iranian oil proceeds. This is not symbolic pressure. This is a tourniquet applied to a specific artery. And the inclusion of Chinese entities is particularly notable because it represents a direct challenge to the assumption central to Iran's multipolar buffer thesis that Beijing's economic relationship with Washington would prevent the United States from taking actions that impose costs on Chinese actors. The third component is the least visible but arguably the most consequential. Washington has begun accelerating the delivery of specific capability packages to Israel and to certain Gulf partners that directly address Iran's nuclear threshold proximity. This includes additional Iron Dome and David Sling interceptor batteries. But more significantly, it includes the resumption of deliveries of GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator munitions, the 30,000-pound bunker-busting bombs specifically designed to reach hardened underground facilities. Fordow, Iran's most protected enrichment site, is buried under nearly 80 meters of mountain. The GBU-57 is one of the very few conventional munitions capable of threatening it. The decision to resume those deliveries, which had been quietly paused during the 2024 ceasefire negotiations, is a message written not in diplomatic language, but in ordnance specifications. Tehran understands exactly what it means. The fourth component is the intelligence and interdiction operation targeting the Iranian arms supply chain into Yemen and Lebanon. 3 separate maritime interdictions in the Gulf of Oman between late March and early April of 2025, each involving vessels carrying weapon system components to Houthi or Hezbollah-affiliated recipients, represent a significant step up in operational tempo. These are not the sporadic interdictions of previous years. They reflect a decision to impose systematic friction on the logistics chain that sustains Iran's proxy network, which directly undermines the proxy resilience layer that Tehran had counted as one of its strategic assets. Each of these 4 components, taken alone, is significant. Taken together, they represent something more structured, a simultaneous degradation of Iran's financial base, its nuclear deterrent calculus, its proxy logistics chain, and its perception of American political paralysis. Washington did not respond on one dimension. It responded on all 4 simultaneously, which is precisely what a strategy assembled over 18 months, rather than improvised in 72 hours, looks like when it is activated. Let us now examine the scenario space, because history does not run on rails, and there are at least 4 distinct trajectories that emerge from this moment, each with its own internal logic and its own set of determining variables. The first scenario is managed de-escalation through back-channel diplomacy. In this scenario, the Omani back-channel, which has historically served as the quietest and most reliable conduit between Washington and Tehran, is activated within the next 30 to 60 days. Iran's leadership, confronting the simultaneous activation of 4 pressure dimensions, makes a strategic decision to pursue tactical retreat while framing it domestically as continued resistance. Uranium enrichment activities are quietly capped below a mutually agreed threshold. Secondary sanctions begin to ease. The carrier deployments become routine rotations rather than sustained forward presence. This scenario is possible. The conditions for it to work are that Iranian domestic politics, particularly the hardline factions within the Revolutionary Guard, who have the most to lose from any diplomatic accommodation, do not torpedo the back-channel process before it can produce results. The probability is not negligible. It is also not the base case. The second scenario is sustained calibrated pressure, with proxy conflict contained below the escalation threshold. In this scenario, neither side wants direct military confrontation, but neither side is prepared to offer the political concessions necessary for genuine de-escalation. Washington maintains the financial and military pressure. Iran continues to direct its proxy network to impose costs. Houthi harassment of Red Sea shipping, limited rocket fire from Iraqi militia positions, Hezbollah maintaining tension on Israel's northern border, but keeps those activities below the level that would trigger a decisive Israeli or American kinetic response. This scenario produces a prolonged war of attrition at the proxy level while the principles maintain plausible deniability. It is corrosive rather than acute. It drains resources, disrupts trade, destabilizes regional economies, and produces exactly the kind of slow-burn crisis that is most difficult for democratic political systems to sustain attention and will around. The probability of this scenario is relatively high. The third scenario is what strategic analysts call the miscalculation cascade. In this scenario, one or more of the ongoing proxy operations crosses a threshold, either in terms of American casualties, Israeli casualties, or the targeting of a civilian or infrastructure asset of sufficient symbolic significance that produces a politically unavoidable military response. The history of escalation dynamics in the Middle East suggests that cascades of this kind are rarely intended by any of the parties at the outset. The Houthi attack on the USS Mason in October 2016, the IRGC mining of tankers in the Strait of Hormuz in 2019, the killing of American contractors in rocket attacks on Iraqi bases in early 2020, each of these was a step that the party responsible appears to have calculated would remain below the response threshold, and each produced a response that surprised them. The third scenario is not the most probable, but it is not the least probable either. and its consequences, if it materializes, are categorically different in scale and duration from the first two. The fourth scenario is the one that Western strategic analysts discuss in private and rarely publish. It is the scenario in which Iran's nuclear program reaches a point of no return, a technical threshold beyond which even the most capable conventional strike cannot reliably halt it, and the decision calculus for Israel, facing an existential security question that no other actor faces with the same immediacy, produces a unilateral action regardless of American preferences. This scenario has been analyzed in detail by serious institutions. The Atlantic Council, the RAND Corporation, and various Israeli security establishments have all produced classified and semi-public work on this contingency. It remains the scenario that concentrates the most attention and the most dread, because its second and third order consequences, Iranian retaliation, regional conflagration, potential closure of the Strait of Hormuz, and an oil price shock that would dwarf anything experienced since 1973, would reach every economy on Earth within weeks. The determining variable across all four scenarios is the same. It is whether Iran's supreme decision-making body, ultimately the office of Ali Khamenei and the small circle of Revolutionary Guard commanders who advise him, correctly recalibrates their strategic assessment in the face of Washington's response, or whether they interpret the response itself as further evidence of adversarial weakness and double down on the victorious framing. History is not encouraging on this point. Authoritarian systems with ideologically committed leaderships and strong internal incentives against admitting strategic error have a poor track record of recalibration under pressure. They are more likely to escalate their public posture while quietly testing for off-ramps. That combination, louder public confidence, quieter private reassessment, is precisely what the next 30 days will reveal. Let us close with the larger lesson, because the story of Iran declaring victory too soon is not simply a story about one country or one moment in the Middle East. It is a story about a recurring feature of the international order that becomes most dangerous precisely when the order is changing rapidly, as it is tonight. We are living through a genuine transition in the architecture of global power. The unipolar moment, the period from 1991 to roughly 2015, when American military and financial dominance was so overwhelming that it functioned almost like a background condition of international relations, is over. That is real. The rise of China, the reconstitution of Russian military ambition, the development of alternative financial systems, the proliferation of precision weapons technology, all of it is real, and it has genuinely complicated American strategic options in ways that would have been inconceivable in 1995. Regional powers have observed this transition accurately. But there is a profound danger in the transition itself, and that danger is this. The moment of maximum uncertainty about the new order is also the moment of maximum temptation to test the old order's limits prematurely. Iran is not the first and will not be the last regional actor to look at the genuine constraints on American power and conclude that those constraints amount to strategic opportunity. What the historical record reveals, without exception, is that the actors who make this transition from observing real constraint to declaring real paralysis consistently discover that the distance between those two things is enormous, and that the discovery comes at a very high cost. The United States is neither the omnipotent hegemon of 1991 nor the broken and retreating power that its adversaries have been advertising. It is something more complicated and more dangerous to underestimate, a mature power with genuine constraints, genuine domestic divisions, and genuine strategic fatigue, but also with a depth of financial capacity, military technology, alliance management skill, and institutional memory that no regional power has yet successfully overwhelmed. The $36 trillion debt is real. The political divisions are real. And the four-dimensional response that activated this week, assembled quietly while Iran was declaring victory, is also real. What happens next in the Persian Gulf will shape the next decade of Middle Eastern history. It will shape oil prices, regional alliances, the fate of nuclear non-proliferation as a global regime, and the credibility of American commitments to every partner from Riyadh to Tokyo. History is watching. The decisions made in the next 30 days are not reversible. And the audience that understands the architecture behind the headlines, rather than just the headlines themselves, will be far better positioned to understand what those decisions actually mean when they arrive. If tonight's analysis gave you something that the surface coverage did not, if it changed the angle from which you are watching this crisis, subscribe to this channel. What is coming next in this story is not going to slow down. It is going to accelerate. And in the next video, we are going to examine the question that no one is yet asking about this crisis. What happens to the Gulf Cooperation Council states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the others, if Washington's pressure campaign succeeds? Because the answer to that question may contain the most important geopolitical surprise of the next 18 months. That video is coming. Make sure you are here for it. Before you go tonight, tell us in the comments what you believe is the most likely outcome of the next 30 days. Does Iran de-escalate through back channels? Does the proxy conflict grind on below the escalation threshold? Or does something happen that none of the planners in Washington or Tehran have fully prepared for? The floor is yours. We read every comment, and we will see you in the next one.